Um, so glad you can join us today. My name is Anne-Marie Cregan, and I'm the Continuing Education Coordinator for the Arizona State Library. So glad that you can take the time and for the training on the virtual programming kits today. Just a reminder that the state library values the outcomes and the stories that might come from using the kits, and IMLS would love to share the results of the distribution of the CARES Act money. So anything that comes up when you're using these kits, you have any great stories, let us know. Send us an email so that we can go ahead and make sure we report those to IMLS with the CARES funding. And looks like it's just about 2 o'clock now. We've got 13 people in the meeting, so I'm going to hand it over to Peter Grant, the library branch supervisor for the Downtown Sky Library. And thank you so much for doing this for us, Peter. Go ahead.
Alrighty, thanks Anne-Marie for having me, and thanks for supporting the virtual programming efforts of public libraries through the availability of these kits. Before we get started, I'll just tell you a little bit about how I landed in the presenter's seat today. Basically, I've been a hobbyist photographer since I was a teenager. And when COVID-19 hit and virtual programming became the only real option for serving our public and reaching our patrons, I happened to be positioned with personal equipment and experience that allowed us to pretty quickly and easily ramp up some virtual programming. The kits that you got are about a notch below a semi-professional amateur videography kit. Today, we're going to primarily focus on the concepts behind what you're doing with the camera, as opposed to going over exactly how to do it. If anybody has questions, I'm more than happy to chat with anybody or walk you through something on the phone. Since this crisis has begun, I've trained 2 other staff members on how to use this equipment, so it should be pretty straightforward. I've got our outline up. Basically, why not just use your phone? And then we'll go over some video basics, resolution, exposure, white balance, and a little bit about setting up the camera to get yourself rolling. So basically, the reason to use a camera such as the one in these kits is better image quality, a longer record time, and an easier to use form factor. There is a degree of control exercised over a video camera and or a sophisticated still camera that a telephone simply cannot match. And although smartphones have done amazing things with what's known as computational photography, i.e. the magic the software does, in the end, there is still no trumping physics. And when it comes to photography, bigger is better. A larger image sensor is going to give you better image quality. A larger camera body is going to better manage the heat that's generated by the sensor when filming video, and larger sensors tend to dictate larger lenses. So the whole thing gets bigger. So from there, we're going to roll into our video basics. The camera you have is capable of recording in several different resolutions. Resolution is kind of the fineness or the number of pixels recorded. Higher resolution equals higher detail. However, higher resolution also means larger file sizes, which depending on where you are or what editing software you are using might slow you down. If you're in an area that doesn't have great broadband and you're using an online editing system such as the tools offered by YouTube, or you've subscribed to something like WeVideo, then dealing with 4K footage might present you with some challenges. The other challenge, higher resolution video, is often going to be storage. Typically, when we film a story time, we have close to 10 gigabytes of raw footage before we've thrown out the clips we don't want and edited together the clips that we do for the final product. Um, Many cities, many public library systems don't have access to that kind of storage to sustain doing that for the long term. My laptop at work has a 128 gigabyte hard drive. You can imagine how many videos we can film and store on that laptop before we run out of space, especially given the other storage needs for things like images, my day-to-day work, spreadsheets, and so forth. Runs out pretty quickly. One of the advantages to filming at something like 4K is that you can crop in when you edit. So rather than filming two separate clips or zooming in for a particular portion, you can just take that 4K footage, crop into it to something that is 1080 or even 720 and still have a usable image. So it will in part be a personal local choice, whether you film in 4K, 1080, or 720. Your users might start to notice if you're filming in 720 resolution, but 1080 is basically what is recommended by YouTube at this point for uploading, and that should be okay for most applications. So just something to consider when you set up your camera for the recording of video and choosing the resolution that you film at. So now we're going to talk about exposure, and thank you to those of you who completed the rough and ready survey that Anne-Marie sent out. Here's where we're going to talk about the exposure triangle, which in still photography is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. When it comes to video, we've also got to kind of take a pause and talk about frame rate as well. So basically your frame rate is how many frames per second the camera films, and obviously when you play those back, your video is nothing but a series of still images played back fast enough that your mind thinks it is one moving image. A higher frame rate is going to give you larger files and more editing. However, higher frame rates have useful applications in terms of if you wanted to do a Steam video and you wanted to do a slow-mo showing that rocket balloon go across the string, filming at a faster frame rate and then playing it back slower might be worthwhile. I don't know how many people are familiar with sort of Charlie Chaplin era movies, but those were filmed at about 18 or 20 frames per second and played back faster, which is why you get that weird choppy look and that Charlie Chaplin walk. You could probably go onto YouTube and find some comparable footage if you want a visual for that. Most movie projectors film at 24 frames per second. And to be perfectly honest, we film our story time at 24 frames per second. These days, that choice is usually for an artistic effect. You want to make something look more old school cinematic. It gives you a little bit smaller file size. And when it comes to fast action, the fastest action in our story times is Skinamarink. So there are no real ill effects there. Most modern video is filmed at 29.97 frames per second. I feel that the 24 frames gives us a little bit smaller file size. And also when it comes to shutter speed, which we'll be talking about on our next slide here, gives us a tiny bit more latitude in terms of exposure. Because your shutter speed can't be set at a slower rate than your frame rate, obviously, because you won't be able to fit all of the frames in a second. If my shutter is open for a 20th of a second, I can only do that 20 times in a second. If you wanted another example of sort of a modern day cinematic look when it came to frame rate, if you're familiar with the movie Dunkirk, that was shot on IMAX film, large format 70 millimeter. And if you look at some of the beach scenes where the soldiers are walking, they kind of have a slightly unnatural looking walk to them. That is because of the slower frame rate. But again, when it comes to story time, we're not walking around a whole lot. We're not doing a whole lot of fast action. Oop, went one too far. So again, we've kind of gotten into some of these concepts a little bit, but fundamentally shutter speed will also influence the look of your footage. If your shutter speed is too slow, you're going to blur your movement. If it's too fast, it will look unnatural and robotic. Your shutter speed does have to be faster than your frame rate. Typically, when the professionals do video, their shutter speed is about twice their frame rate. So if you were filming 24 frames per second, the camera we're using typically offers 1/40th or 1/50th of a second for a shutter speed. I've dropped that down to 1/25th of a second, so just fast enough to get those 24 frames per second in the shot. And it doesn't look strange. It doesn't look terribly unnatural. It looks okay given the fact that, again, we're not doing a whole lot of fast action. We don't have a whole lot of movement. Largely our story times are stationary, or the motions are deliberately slow because we're trying to teach 3, 4, and 5-year-olds to follow along. All right, do we have any questions so far? Just out of curiosity.
Nothing in the chat.
All right.
I don't know if anyone wants to chime in with a question.
All right, so the next concept we'll talk about is aperture. And aperture regulates the amount of light into the lens. You will see on the camera's menu, it shows aperture. Your apertures are typically 3.5, 5.6, f8. Digital cameras do numbers in between as well. But the lower the number, the wider open the lens is, the more light it lets in. The higher numbers, the smaller the aperture of the lens is, the less light it lets in. Now, the primary purpose of aperture is to control the amount of light into the lens. However, one side effect of aperture is it influences the depth of field, which is the amount of distance both before and behind the subject that are in focus at a given aperture. A wider aperture is going to give you less depth of field. A narrower aperture is going to give you more depth of field. Now, our story times, we typically shoot at f5.6, which on these particular cameras, they have a smaller sensor. They generally have naturally a wider depth of field than some other cameras available on the market that have larger sensors. So this slide is to illustrate that concept of depth of field. You'll see the marker in focus is actually the black one, and the pink marker, which is very close, is pretty blurry. The brown marker way in back is also relatively blurry. If we look at a smaller aperture, f18, you can see the pink marker in front is much sharper, as is the black marker all the way at the back. Again, something like f5.6, f4 on a story time scene should get everything in focus in such a way that you can set your focus at one point, film your video, and not have to worry about changing focus or adjusting focus. Next, we have the concept of ISO, or ISO, as people have started calling it in the digital era. ISO used to stand for International Standards Organization. In the film days, that number was the sensitivity of the film. So film would be ISO 25, ISO 400. These days, the term has kind of carried over, but it is the sensor's sensitivity to light, which is done by boosting the electrical signal. What you need to know about ISO is the higher numbers, the more sensitive to light the camera is going to be. The lower the numbers, the less sensitive. Now, higher ISO, which you would use basically in a darker area, also comes at the expense of more noise and grain. We'll see examples of that in the next couple of slides. But for practical library purposes, we've shot some of our Steam videos at ISO 3200. And for video, for our purposes, that has been fine. That's probably pushing it for a still photo from these cameras, but as long as you're shooting video, because again, you're seeing one image quickly presented after another, and they blend together into a video, some of those negative effects are mitigated. And they're actually somewhat difficult to illustrate, especially over the web on the size of images we're dealing with. But here is a shot in a dark hallway of our friend's book sale. And the shot on your left was shot at ISO 800. The one on the right was ISO 3200. Now you can see that the higher ISO shot, the back paneling of the bookshelf has a little less sharpness to it. You can see there's kind of a weird color cast. You can see that the text block of those books that were tipped forward in the front are not quite as sharp and clearly defined in the ISO 3200 shot. So slight differences. The differences are typically amplified in a still shot over a video shot. But that'll give you a feel for kind of what the sacrifices are if you were to shoot at a higher ISO. Our next concept, and this is something that again you need to be aware of, it may or may not be an issue for you, is what is called white balance. And that is how the camera represents pure white. This again will be a local issue. By default, the camera automatically adjusts for white balance. But if, like your library, my library has a couple of different banks of lights that run at different color temperatures. Your halogen lights, your incandescent lights, your fluorescent lights can all cast a different off-white color. So you may have to adjust the white balance a little bit. The camera menu, which we'll talk about in a little bit, pretty clearly gives you some choices. You could also get into doing a custom white balance if you want to, but again, this is just to illustrate the concept. The upper right image, or upper left image, I'm sorry, was shot on auto white balance, and you can see it looks pretty realistic. Our off-white signage, the beige shelving, the light from the windows, all looks pretty natural. I don't remember what I adjusted the setting to. I believe it was daylight for the next image to the right, but you can see how it's definitely more of a yellowy orange. And then we've got some blue-green based on setting the white balance to color cast to them. It is probably a white balance issue, and that's fairly easy to correct in the menus of your camera. So far we have pretty quickly covered resolution, exposure, frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and white balance. Do we have any questions at this point?
No questions in the chat, so I want to chime in.
All right, we'll keep rolling forward. Sorry, I'm using a touchpad on this laptop. So the camera in the kit is a Panasonic Lumix G85. It is what is known as a micro four thirds camera, and it is considered to be a very good all-arounder. The camera one notch above this, which depending on the time period you're looking at, Panasonic GH4, Panasonic GH5, has been very, very commonly deployed in amateur video and movie making. This one offers much of what that can do, but not everything. But it was also one of the first first sort of $1,000 and under 4K cameras that could produce competitive footage. At this point, we'll go over the controls just to give you a feel for what the buttons are and what the buttons do. Has anybody actually pulled the camera out and shot with it yet? I know we've had some issues with memory cards and tripods, but has anybody put the camera to use? We'll give people a minute just to see. All right, so I'm not getting any response. But one thing you have to keep in
Yep,
mind
couple.
is,
Oh, sorry.
oh,
I got a bunch of people chiming in that they have taken it out a little bit. We haven't. It was great. This is Martha. Oh, sorry, Danny doesn't have our kit yet. So, yep, we do have a
okay,
few people that have pulled it out of the boxes and looked at it.
okay.
Oh, Michelle recorded a program.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So we'll go over the default function of the buttons a little bit. One thing that you can also note with this particular camera and with most modern digital cameras, in the menus you can reassign most of the buttons to do almost anything the camera is capable of doing. But again, we're trying to teach enough to get you started and hopefully provide an understanding of the concepts so that if you run into an issue, you've got the background knowledge to troubleshoot. So the first button that you'll want to familiarize yourself with is that mode dial, which is the big button with the PASM on top. And you will see that I have this one set to M and the little image of that movie camera. When you film video with this camera, that is the mode you want to be in. If you leave this camera in program or IA mode and you hit that red record button, what will happen is it will, number one, switch to a cropped frame of view, which means everything you just set up will not be in frame. And number two, it will record at some default settings that you may not necessarily want. The default, I believe it will start recording at 60 frames per second, which you probably don't need and which may fill up your memory card sooner than expected. So make sure that that is set to the video mode. Again, if it is not, as soon as you start recording video, the aspect ratio, which we'll talk about, will change, as will some of the other settings that you may not be aware you've been adjusting. All right, the front dial right here by default will adjust either the aperture or the shutter speed. I believe on my personal camera I switched them from what is standard when it comes out of the box, and since I've gotten the second camera, I'm not sure I've been able to get it right on either one of them. But the front dial will typically adjust aperture or shutter speed. The rear dial, which is the one right here that your thumb naturally falls upon, will do the other of those two functions. All right, you will see going back to the top of the camera, the FN1 button there. If you hit that, that will change the function of the front and rear dials. Now that is something that as you get a little bit more experience with the camera, you might want to adjust to suit your own personal taste. I currently have mine set up to change the color profile, which is kind of a fun menu that you can see in the camera that is separate from white balance. The color profiles change how the camera portrays color. So there will be a vivid mode, a portrait mode that sort of biases towards more flattering skin tones. There will be a natural mode. There will be a mode that's designed for landscapes to kind of make the colors pop. There's also an L monochrome mode if you want to shoot your story time in black and white, which is an idea I mentioned to my staff, and very quickly I got some volunteers to start filming the story time in my place. But you can play around with that if you'd like to. The other thing that you can set the dial to do once you hit that FN1 button is adjusting your ISO. So once you do that, you will have your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO all right there at your forefinger and your thumb tips. The next little toggle that you're going to want to switch right out of the box is the little toggle that is the autofocus toggle that switches between single autofocus, continuous autofocus, and manual focus. And what we want to do with our camera for keeping things like story times and most static shoots simple is switch to manual focus. With these cameras in manual focus mode, if you choose your focus point appropriately, at 5.6, you're not going to have to worry about things being out of focus. If you leave the camera in the autofocus mode during video, the risk you run is that the camera will focus in and out in a way that looks jittery and distracting to the viewer. Again, the focus, don't be afraid of manual focus. It is a set it and forget it kind of setting, at least when we film our story times. About the only time we would have to adjust focus is if we go to a close-up shot of a craft or something like that. All right, so here is kind of a cheat sheet list of the menus. It also kind of lines up all of these settings that I've mentioned so far. And we'll have a screenshot of this in the coming slides to make it more clear. We'll also repeat a variation of this list at the end of the slideshow. Basically, once we see the menus, you'll understand what the numbers mean. Each menu kind of has a number of pages, usually 6. So 1 out of 6 is the first page of 6 pages of this particular menu. We set our recording format to MP4. Like I mentioned before, I film at 4K, 24 frames per second. The image stabilization is a setting that you will want to become intimately familiar with, especially if you start filming handheld. When you have your camera on a tripod, you want to turn the image stabilization off. Otherwise, the computer in the camera won't know what to do and it will kind of jitter, which is the opposite of what you want. If you want to film maybe a quick handheld clip of, again, somebody doing a craft, or maybe it's just too much trouble to film somebody making a brief comment about how they miss your volunteers, you're filming handheld, turn the image stabilization on. These cameras have pretty good image stabilization. The elements of the lens actually work with the sensor inside the camera body to cancel out basic camera shake. Our Steam video on the color wheel was shot handheld, which was an interesting scenario for me. I was told that, this is what the video was about. Here's what we're going to do. And I said, okay. And I found out that I was hand holding the creation of the color wheel, the coloring in of the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. I held that camera for 8 minutes, which was very tiring. Doesn't result in necessarily the best footage, but it turned out pretty darn good given the situation, and I was a little bit sore afterwards, to be honest. So definitely, if you're doing something handheld, make sure you turn that image stabilization back on. It will make your job much easier. The microphone level adjustment is also something that you will have to consider in light of your local situation. It could be that you set your camera up and you never touch it. It could be that you find yourself changing it all the time. When we move our equipment between branches, one of our branches has a fairly loud AC system. It also has a fairly open design where ambient noise from 25 feet away can occasionally be picked up. Some staff have softer or louder voices. but the mic level adjustment gives you a way of tweaking the sensitivity of the microphone. The microphone included in these kits is what is known as a shotgun mic. And what it does is it is biased towards sound that is directly in front of it. So for those of you who can see video or who have pulled your microphone out of the box, you'll notice once you pull that sound deadening device off of it, it's shaped like a tube and it's basically pointed towards the front. It doesn't zoom in on sound. It is simply biased towards the sound in front of it. So you may need to turn that level up or down depending again on your environment or the voices of your staff. Wind noise cancellation, digital setting on the camera. I've actually never shot video outside where I've needed to use that, but if you find yourself doing something outside, you might want to turn that on. It can help take away some of that ambient wind noise. All right. So here is an example of the actual menu on the camera. Now you can probably see our 4 out of 6, our stabilizer, and what exactly that means in the context of the camera's menu. The camera has a touch screen. You can also navigate the menu using the directional pad surrounding the menu button on the back of the camera, whichever one you prefer. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what is known as zebra patterns. The zebra pattern menu is found in the custom settings menu, which is the second one down from the video menu on page 5 of the 10 pages of menu options. You'll also notice that when you look at the menu, on the very, very top of the menu screen, there's some scrolling text. That tells you exactly what that setting does. So take a look at that if you have any questions. But what zebra patterns do is they point out the areas that are basically too bright to be properly exposed. So here we have a shot of the camera's screen with zebra patterns turned on. And you can see all of those black lines cutting diagonally across that photo and that white wall. Those areas would be drastically overexposed or too bright were we to videotape them. So the zebra patterns, if you feel like you're having trouble determining proper exposure, they will show you what is overexposed, and it can be a really, really handy way of taking a look at that. The next menu setting that you might find helpful, especially if you feel like you're having trouble working with the manual focus settings on the camera, is the peaking menu. And when you set the peaking menu to on, it shows you the areas that are in focus. You can set the peaking to be either weak or strong, depending on your personal preference. You can also set the color of the peaking, I believe, to red or blue. Here we've got blue on our example here, and you can see the edges of the frames there are highlighted in blue. The legs of the chairs are highlighted in blue. The peaking tends to work better on areas of sharp contrast or sharp definition. One of the online programs we do is an origami activity, which is mostly just somebody's hands folding a piece of paper from above. In order to ensure that things are in focus, what I do is that particular staff member, I have her hold her hand still with her wedding ring up, and it's actually seeing that blue from the peaking on her wedding ring that allows me to really confirm that the shot is in focus. Because we have a pretty flat table background, and then we have hands which are typically soft and not necessarily having the sharp enough contrast to readily appear to be in focus. All right, so we're going to take a little brief stop to talk about aspect ratio. When you film video, you will be filming in a 16:9 aspect ratio. The camera is capable of adjusting its aspect ratio for still photos. This can save you a lot of time, and it can make any still images that you insert into your videos a little bit more professional looking, and it can help you do this a little bit more easily. But by default, this particular camera will shoot in what is known as a 4:3 aspect ratio. That is what we've got on the upper left here. If you go to the image just below it, that is a 3:2 aspect. 5 millimeter film was back in the film days. That's what a lot of other modern digital cameras shoot in by default, is that 3:2. For comparison's sake, our image on the upper right is 1:1 or square. And then below we have a 16:9 still image. Now, if I wanted to drop that particular still image into video, I could drop that 16:9 aspect ratio image in there, and you wouldn't see any black bars on the top, the bottom, or the sides. It wouldn't look like vertical video played on television news, where they have a little video taking up a third of the screen, and then they've got blurred out effects on both sides of it. That will fill your video. It tends to make any still images you introduce to the video look a little bit more professional, a little bit less jarring. So be sure, if you want to shoot, again, like the final product of a craft, if you shoot it in 16:9, it makes editing it into your video much, much easier. Right. Lost my mouse. All right, so to wrap things up at this point, here's kind of a bullet point summary of what you would want to set on the camera to get yourself rolling, and where they are on the camera's menus. I'm not sure what the video background is of everybody here. I'm certainly more than happy to take questions, but hopefully these concepts will give you an understanding of the equipment you're working with and equip you to troubleshoot any issues that you run into. If you have any questions with regards to setting up the equipment, or you run into issues, here is my contact information. And hopefully, I'm more than willing to help you work through it. Hopefully you've come to this with a little bit of a background or an interest, and more importantly, a willingness to experiment a little. And I hope that you will find this equipment helpful to you and your patrons in terms of the virtual programming that we all find ourselves doing these days. So with that, I'm open to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. Do we have any questions that anyone wants to either put in the chat or um, chime in? Okay, doesn't look like we have anybody have questions in the chat, so we'll thank you so much. I did want to just add too, I know Peter and I were talking a little bit about this before the presentation, about some of the copyright as we move forward and start doing some of the virtual programming. And at the beginning of the chat, I did put in a lot of resources that I just received from, I was at ALA Virtual this past week, and they went to one of the sessions that they had on story times and virtual programming. And it does, I know so many of our libraries have jumped into virtual programming with Storytime as their first go-to, and most of the copyright that publishers are allowed to go through the pandemic is ending June 30th. So just be aware of that. So that means really like taking a book and reading it from beginning to end and showing all of the pictures, and that the the permissions for that are ending tomorrow, actually. And Peter and I were discussing this a little bit before everyone was on the call. And he was talking, I don't know if you want to jump in here, Peter, but he was talking about how maybe they were going to pivot a little bit and do more of like story, like rhymes and finger plays and things like that, rather than reading a whole book. So that's just something to keep in mind as you start on this journey as well.
Right. Unfortunately, there was no real set of, hey, this is what public libraries need to succeed in this environment, put out there in terms of permissions that publishers could grant. So what we were left with was the 40-page document that you're probably all familiar with at School Library Journal, which was a compilation of all of the permissions issued by the various publishers. Every publisher has different requirements for when they want the material taken down, where you can post the material, if they want you to email them and notify them that you're using the material, and so forth. So even if you go through all of that, you decide what would work for you, what would work with the resources you have. You still have to keep up with, am I meeting their requirements? And then on top of all of that, finding a book that fits the theme you want from the publisher whose permissions you feel you're comfortable with has been a challenge in and of itself. So I don't know what other libraries have been thinking at this point, but we are definitely going to pivot a bit more towards a story time, effectively without the reading of the book. We've got some ideas in terms of activities and things like that. We've also found, based on the data that we've gotten from Facebook, YouTube, and so forth, a lot of people don't make it through the story. They really are there for that interactive activity, that craft, that literacy tip that we give. So that's kind of what we're thinking. I'd be interested in hearing what other libraries are kind of thinking. Have you gotten into posting story times yet? Have you been doing it live? Um, what else is out there? Because one of the ways we're going to have to navigate these uncharted waters is by knowing, who's where and running into what.
Right. Yeah, excellent point. And that's also something too that we can always we've had some luck with the meetings that we've had with groups of librarians that are trying to, like you said, Peter, navigate the waters. So that's something that we could always get together too if people want, once they start using the equipment and putting these programs out there. Maybe we could just have just a meeting where everyone just jumps on and shares their problems, their thoughts, their ideas, and how we're navigating it. Let's see, Allison just chimed in the chat. Anne-Marie, is there a current copyright information brief that you could send out to the group? I would appreciate it. And yes, to meeting this. Yeah, if you at the very beginning of the chat, there was the most current. I put in the links to what is the most current that's out there. School Library Journal has a lot of the links as to what
Mm-hmm.
publishers have, and that link is in there as well in the beginning of the chat. But they're the ones that have been keeping the most up to date on the publishers that are offering the copyright information. Craig says we plan on providing our camera to patrons who want to do their own vlogging along with story times in the youth department. Okay. Kelly says a video programming group would be really helpful, and Michelle chimes in that she agrees. So yeah, that's maybe something. Okay, now listen too. So that could be something. I also noticed in the chat that many people said that they actually haven't received their kits yet. So I know from speaking with Rochelle that everything has been shipped. So you should be hopefully receiving it very soon. I thought that everyone had received it. So um, and then a question about the memory cards. I know we did have a bit of a problem with the memory card. The memory cards that we ordered with the kits were discontinued. So we're in a bit of a process trying to get those out to you as well. So hang on for those. Um, and I know a few people joined the call late as well. So just as a quick reminder too, that we at the State Library, we really value the outcomes and the stories that you might come across as you use these kits with your patrons and in your libraries. And so we would love if you'd share the results of these so that we can show that back to IMLS, how the CARES Act funding is being used. So that's great. So if there's any other, great, thank you for, Craig says, will do. So if is there any other comments, or Peter, do you have any parting words?
No, again,
Okay.
thank you all for taking the time. I hope that you find these kits productive, and thank you for the State Library for being willing to work so quickly and get this equipment out to support us through this crisis.
And And thank you, Peter, because I know this was a lot of your time and effort, and Peter actually put together the kits for me because I have no idea what I'm doing in that department. So, so a big shout out to Peter and thank you for that. And Pam, where will we find the recording? I'll send out a link because I'll have to upload it, and then it will be on our YouTube channel. So that'll take me a day or so, and then I will send that out to you. All right. So anything else, and then we'll sign off here. Okay. Everyone have a great day. Thanks.